Culture shock. When somebody leaves their normative or formative culture and they enter into a different culture, it produces a shock called culture shock. I've had 5 times in my life where I've experienced culture shock. It has led to me being a multicultural believer and multicultural leader. The first cross cultural experience that I had that produced a culture shock in me was actually coming to faith in Christ. I did not grow up in the faith. I didn't grow up going to church. We never went. We didn't go on Christmas or Easter. And so coming to faith was a crisis, if you will, was a culture shock for me. And entering into the church, I didn't know any of the customs or courtesies or ways of being a Christian in the church. But very early, I experienced it, and there were moments of challenge, but there were also moments of beauty. The second came shortly thereafter. Within the first year of coming to faith in Christ, I ended up studying for the ASVAB and I joined the Air Force. I didn't go active duty. So I went to boot camp, I went to tech school, and as a reservist, I was able to stay in my hometown. And I pursued a career in law enforcement. I thought I'd be a lay pastor in the local church I was attending and spent 30 years in law enforcement, 30 years in the Air Force Reserves, but God had a different plan. So the culture shock that I experienced from military and law enforcement culture, even the law enforcement academy that I was a part of, I was the class commander, only African American in my class, and it was a part of me being formed and shaped into a cross-cultural leader. The third came after I married the girl who led me to Christ. She didn't get stationed in my hometown. She didn't get re-upped for orders. And so she ended up being stationed here in Norfolk, Virginia. And moving from Florida to Southeast Virginia, it was culture shock for me. This area, in my estimation, it is more progressive. Some folks will say Virginia is the South. I do not believe that Virginia is the South. I think it's north of the South. It has some East Coast flavor, so it's lower East Coast, but north of the South. But nevertheless, it was a culture shock coming to Virginia. Next would be going to a predominantly white Christian university. I studied the Bible in that context, got introduced to Reformed theology in that context. It was around the same time where Christian hip hop was Reformed theology on wax. And so those two worlds were merging and synthesizing where I felt a little bit culturally at home, but it was still new for me to learn Christianity in an academic context. Shortly after that, I went to a predominantly white independent Baptist seminary where I became the first African American graduate. And both of those experiences were really culture shock for me, and they have contributed to my formation and me being a multicultural believer and leader. And then after that, feeling a call to church planting, you start going to denominational spaces and network and church movement spaces. And all of those spaces for me, as someone who felt called to plant a church, a multicultural church, yes, but really in an urban city, to really reach out to folks in the hood and to see a gospel church sprout up in the hood. So navigating those denominational network and church movement spaces, it was culture shock for me. I'm not mad because I feel a connectivity with Jesus, especially in this season where we're meditating on Christ coming into the world, the eternal Son of God, putting on human flesh, right? Contextualizing himself to live amongst the creation, contextualizing to the point of death, even death on a cross, but showing us the hope that we have by his resurrection from the Spirit. And so I am a multicultural believer and leader by the Spirit connected to Christ. I feel a connectivity with folks like the Apostle Paul, who is familiar with their background, upbringing, cultural, ethnic identity, Paul is familiar with how he's been shaped and formed, but he's also unique in his call to the nations, his call to everybody, to proclaim the gospel to everybody. So those are some of my experiences, the shock, but also the beauty, because God has been forming me and shaping me. I'd love to hear from y'all how you've been shaped and formed in various different spaces that lead to who you are today.